Hello, everyone. I am Ben Johnson, and this is the Perpetual Chess Podcast. Perpetual Chess is a weekly chess interview show where we talk with accomplished chess players, authors, and personalities about their lives, their careers, and how to improve at chess. Perpetual Chess is brought to you through the generosity of its Patreon and PayPal supporters and by Chessable.com. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess, Chess Books Recaptured. We are talking about a very popular book this week, and we've got a popular returning co-host. And by the way, it's by a very popular author, GM Yasser Seirawan, with I am Jeremy Silman helping him out. So this is a book that's especially helpful for club players, and our guest co-host, Neal Bruce, who we will introduce in a minute, picked this one because those of you who follow him on Twitter know that he's a voracious reader of chess books and other books as well. And this was his pick out of all the books that he read. And this is not one that I'd read, but obviously Yasser is a much beloved figure who I dream of someday getting on the podcast. So I was happy to talk about it and happy to have Neal back. For those of you who haven't heard this type of show before, this is where basically every month, except for last month, we take a break from interviewing someone properly and actually read and discuss a chess book. So I think it's a good way if you're trying to decide if you want to read a certain book or just refresh some memories or learn a few concepts while you're on the go or doing the dishes or whatever. It's a nice way to do it, and it's a nice break from format for me. So without further ado, let's bring in our popular guest co-host, returning after our first discussion of Woodpecker method in April of 2020, and now joining us again here in October, Neal Bruce. What's new, Neal?
Hey, Ben, I am so excited to be back with you. I felt like it was a blast talking about Woodpecker method, and I've been really focused on studying strategy, and I really love this book. I'm excited to talk about it. A little bit about me. I'm 51 years old. I've got a full-time job and a family. I learned the rules of chess from my father as a child, but I didn't really study chess until my late 30s. I played my first tournament game when I was 40. My first rating was a little over 1100. I'm now rated a little over 1700. And as you know, I spent the last 4 years working on mastering basic tactics. Now I'm focused on mastering basic strategy. And I've studied a bunch of books on strategy so far this year. I read Simple Chess, Best Lessons of a Chess Coach, Amateur Mind, How to Reassess Your Chess, Chess Strategy for Club Players, Find the Right Plan, and Winning Chess Strategies. And I'm telling you, for somebody who's kind of below the 2000 level, I'm convinced that Winning Chess Strategies by Yasser with Jeremy Silman is the best intro to strategy book. We'll talk about why, but I'm really glad that it's now been reprinted by Everyman. And my goal in this podcast is to get everyone to fall in love with the book. Okay.
Yeah. And time is the most precious resource. So anyone who's trying to figure out what to study, and I would say that this is an episode that is kind of special for club players. Shout out to all you club players out there. I consider myself as like former 2200, now 2100. I consider myself as like a fringe club player, but I will say that this book, I did feel like it's definitely more basic than some of the other books we've talked about, which I think is a good thing. And I know that club players in particular often feel like the strategy aspect can be a little daunting, especially if you don't have a coach. We're always saying do tactics, and you can just do tactics trainers if you want to improve at tactics. And there's many other puzzle books that you can get. But for club players, in order to explain complicated chess concepts in an understandable language, there aren't that many choices. That's why Jeremy Silman is so beloved, and that's why we did a podcast with Todd Kennedy about how to reassess your chess. And I know that was a popular podcast. But as Neal will say, and I think I might agree, this may be an even better book, and it's certainly an easier read. I mean, it's a lot shorter and more to the point, although certainly both books are worthwhile in my opinion. But I don't want to give away too much of the content of what we're going to say when we review the book, but that should give you an overview if you're trying to decide if this podcast is worth your time. We'll go through some of the basic concepts that Yasser explains and share some favorite quotes and games and stuff like that. I did also want to talk about formatting. One good thing about this book is it's available in like every format under the sun. It's still in print, in paperback, reasonably priced. You can get it in Kindle. It's now newly available on Chessable. Shout out to Chessable. So if you want to do Move Trainer, with this book, you can do that. And of course, Yasser even made lots of videos with Chessable and is working through other books from a series called Winning Chess, where he's published many beloved books and starting to share them on Chessable. So you've got, and it's on Forward Chess too, I should say. So lots of options. For me personally, I got it on Chessable, but then realized that for this particular podcast, since I'm highlighting so much, that it made more sense for me to just read it on Kindle so that I can go back. But if you're reading it just for your own edification, then I think any of these formats are good depending on your preferred reading style. And Neal, you always keep it real with the actual paper book, right?
I do. In fact, I bought the original Microsoft printed series, this whole series, Strategies being part of it, years ago. Didn't really study it till more recently. And when I printed, I posted on Twitter that my old Microsoft version, Everyman Chess actually reached out to me and said, hey, you need to get the updated revised version. And so they shipped me for free of the brand new version, which does have lots of corrections. I've compared them side by side. It's absolutely worth getting the new Everyman Chess one. But I was really, a shout out to them for taking care of me. And I love using a physical board and a highlighter and a pencil and writing all over my chess books and trying to figure out the positions with my board. And if I totally can't figure it out, I'll pull out my computer and it'll help me. But I think that there's something really valuable about doing the work. I will say, though, that having seen a clip of the Chessable video that goes along with the course that Yasser did for Winning Chess Strategies, there's got to be something super powerful about watching Yasser bring this book alive and talking to you in that Yasser voice that is so iconic. So I'm sure that the Chessable version would also be great.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to individual learning style, but certainly between the fact that there's the main games that this book is comprised of are Yasser games and classic chess games, super famous chess games. And obviously Yasser being the expert of chess and knowing so many legendary figures, that's a good combination for any video that Yasser's going to do, because he can actually talk personally about his battles with Karpov when he shows his game with Karpov or other games that Karpov played, who makes a few appearances in this book. And he's, even if he didn't know someone like Capablanca or someone before his generation, still he's of a rarefied air where he's hearing secondhand stories, not fourth hand, not fifth hand, just something passed on to him. So I would also imagine, I watched the intro video that they did on Chessable, but I didn't watch the whole course. I'm actually more generally, I'm not a video learner. That's just not my learning style. That's why when I interview these Twitch stars, often I have to cram to see what their content is. And even the YouTube stars, it's pretty rare that that's going to be my method of consuming content. Whereas if I interview some author, I'm almost always going to read the book, because similar to you, Neal, I love reading. And that's how I grew up learning chess, and that's how I'm most comfortable learning chess. And of course, this book has been recommended by lots of people on the show, although not as many as some other books. I think part of that is just because we interview a lot of people who came up in kind of the older generation. But GM Robert Hess, who this book was already out when he was a kid, recommended the whole series. So did Lev Alburt, and Stjepan Tomic, who of course is a little bit younger, accomplished adult improver, also known as Hanging Pawns, who does have a great YouTube channel. He recommended the specific book. Grandmaster Maurice Ashley, another person I would love to have on the show, of course, said when he was on Tim Ferris's podcast, Yasser's series was the one series he recommended. And by the way, if you guys haven't heard that interview, I think you would enjoy it. So I'll link to that as well. But anyway, I mean, you guys, anyone listening probably knows about Yasser Seirawan, and it's not a surprise that this book would be worthwhile. So let's dig into what it is that makes this so worthwhile. So what do you think, Neal?
Well, I think that I want to start a little bit by explaining some context. So one of the things I think we should talk about before we dig into the specific benefits of this book are, talking about why strategy and why bother and how does it help us. And so I wrote down in preparation for this 3 things that have changed for me since I started reading strategy. Really, this is a part of where I'm trying to motivate people to even consider this topic. The 3 reasons for me is, one, I love, like most chess players, to watch master tournaments. And before studying strategy, I had no idea what was going on like 80% of the time, because 80% of the time there are no tactics. There's just a bunch of pieces being moved around in seemingly random ways. And so by understanding strategy, you can actually appreciate master tournaments much better. 2, I would often be just clueless in the middle game about what to do. I would kind of randomly move my pieces out to bad squares, not knowing they were bad squares, not paying enough attention to the pawn structures because I didn't really understand what that even meant. And so I would waste like 80% of my clock in the middle game just fumbling around. And then I would get into a time crunch and struggle in the end game and often blunder. So I think saving time is a huge benefit of studying strategy. And then third, I've gotten better at tactics, but unless you're playing a beginner, tactics don't just happen. People don't just blunder whole pieces very often. And so you have to set them up. And by setting up your position and getting one advantage positionally, then another, and then another, then finally you can play that winning tactic that ends up giving you the win. And so for me, being able to better understand master games, saving time in the middle game because I have a clue of what I'm doing, and third, ultimately just winning more games by having strategy set up my tactics has really helped my chess. What are some of the things that you think about on why club players should focus on strategy?
Yeah, I think that's well said. GM Avetik Grigoryan, who I interviewed maybe about a month ago of chessmood.com. He writes some posts in addition to sharing all his videos on his website. And he wrote a pretty compelling piece earlier this week, basically arguing some of the reasons why club players do need to study strategy in particular, and why chess is not just tactics. And he made some strong arguments. He even showed examples where engines can't find things, and he showed a lot of examples where like an engine just can't explain something to you. So obviously the AI in chess is just off the charts and only getting better. And with stuff like Decode Chess attempting to explain ideas to you, that can be helpful. But there's just sort of no substitute for having learned something, having had something passed down to you. And one thing I've noticed through the course of doing this podcast, I started playing chess when I was 12. And the bulk of basically all of my improvement was like 12 to 18 when I was just like immersed in it. And for me, even though I, of course, like every chess player, wish I started earlier, I still feel like it's basically like a native language to me. And that's what I notice when I talk to players like yourself, Neal, who learned it as an adult, that these things that a lot of more experienced players who grew up with chess might consider intuitive, don't necessarily consider intuitive. And there's not that much out there that does a good job explaining it. So for me, this was like a fun stroll down memory lane. And also like sometimes it would give me new language for concepts that I was already familiar with, but often it was better language than the language that I was using. So that had tremendous value to me, both just as a chess player and as a chess teacher. But I can see why for less experienced players, especially adult improvers, it could have even more value. Should we dig into the book, Neal? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, on this book, what do you think is what level is it set for? I'll mention that I would put it at around, kind of 1200-ish to 2000. And, I would say really anyone who doesn't have a firm handle on basic strategy should study this book. I mean, as we talked about in our last podcast, Dalmaza famously won the under 2000 World Open with almost no strategy understanding. And so you can, and I've beat in over the board tournament conditions, long games. I've beat 3 players who were rated over 2000 with zero strategic knowledge, purely tactical knowledge. So there are, I think, lots of players who overestimate their abilities in chess, in particular overestimate their positional understanding. And so I would say that players I've seen who are under 2,000, most of them have a weaker foundation in strategy and would serve themselves well to going back to the basics and reading this book and then following up with other related things. But so that's where I would state it, like 1,200 to 2,000. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I agree. 1,200. I even feel like maybe down to 1,000. Like, it's not the kind of book where if it's a bit of a reach, you're not going to feel lost at sea reading it, because it's explained very clearly, so you might not get everything. But definitely on the lower bound, I agree with you. On the higher one, I'm not as sure. But as I think about it, maybe I'm a little biased because one of the things that made me think maybe this is for slightly less experienced players is I was getting, I think, basically all the quiz questions right, which I never do. Like even Reassess Your Chess, which I also consider to be a more club player friendly book, although I do think that one has slightly more advanced material overall. First of all, it just has more material, but also slightly more advanced. But even that one, a lot of those quizzes stumped me, whereas this one, I felt like I had a pretty good handle on the quizzes. And by the way, we should mention the quizzes, of course, are a great feature. I like them in basically any book that is presenting material in like an explanatory fashion and then quizzes you on it. I'm always on board with that. I always think that's a good way for a book to be presented. Neal, as you read through this book for the first time, how were you generally doing with the quiz questions?
I think I struggled the very first time I read this book, but it was because I really had zero understanding of strategic principles. I agree with you that the tests in Reassess Your Chess are much harder. And in fact, what's great about Reassess Your Chess, Silman grades them. He says, like, this is from 16 to 18. This is from 18 to 2000 or 2200. So I classify Winning Chess Strategies as a basic strategy book, and I classify How to Reassess Your Chess as an intermediate strategy book. We'll talk about this more later. I think that almost all the basic principles are in both, and Winning Chess Strategies is 400 pages less. So if you're trying to understand the basics of strategy, I would not start with a War and Peace like tome, which is How to Reassess Your Chess. I would start with Winning Chess Strategies. I frankly would also put in a plug for Simple Chess. I think that's another excellent small book that's like an intro. But yeah, I like the puzzles. They're definitely easier. I definitely did better on them than How to Reassess Your Chess. But I do think that you make a great point, Ben. People who did not get coached as a child, chess is a different game as an adult. You come to this thing, and it is it's just a mystery wrapped in an enigma in a closed-off dark box. It's like all bits of chess is just really hard to understand. And I'm chugging through it first with basic tactics and now with basic strategy, and like the doors are opening and the lights are coming on, and it's a full discovery kind of situation. But I think that it's very hard for GMs and IMs who were basically at master strength at the age of 12 to relate to a 40 or 50-year-old struggling to understand what is a weak pawn or what is a weak square. These are not obvious concepts to people who didn't grow up with chess.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it's not for nothing, as you mention it, I'm thinking like the other thing is I think these skills, like they do need to be explained, but I think that they might be more learnable in a sense than learning how to calculate many, many moves. Like that's a real stretch. That just takes many, many hours of grunt work. Whereas when Yasser explains a concept like weak squares or something like that, you can begin to grasp it, and then you can be on the lookout and have it on your radar. It's not, because it's just an idea that you hadn't been introduced to. It's not like an act of brute force, the way that calculating 10 moves ahead might be. And for that reason, it's not for nothing that people like Grandmaster Ben Feingold talk about playing positionally as old man chess, because as you get older, you can still have whatever positional sense you had. You're able to keep that and maybe even expand your overall positional skills as life goes on. But calculating is something where if you can maintain a level at a certain age, you're doing well, as opposed to actually improving. Now, again, I don't want to like totally discourage listeners who are, say over 40, like myself and Neal, and want to improve their calculation. It's not to say it can't be done, but we've certainly had our share of. I've had my share of guests on the show who say that, like, even if their calculation at its peak is the same, like you might be able to reach the same height in terms of what you're able to visualize, but there's just going to be more holes in your analysis. You're just going to miss a few moves here and there, and that adds up in a competitive game. So anyway, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but I do think this stuff is important, and hopefully Neal and I have convinced you guys that this is worthwhile, and it's a nice break from tactics as well. So I'd like to dive in and read the opening paragraph, but first let's take a break and hear from our good friends at Chessable. Did you guys know that you can get this course there? So we'll get to my commercial now, and then we'll bring it back and dig into the book. Listeners, you will never believe which Chessable author I am going to promote on this here ad from our friends at Chessable.com. Grandmaster Yasser Seirawan. That's right. In addition to Winning Chess Strategy, which you are hearing plenty about on this podcast, great book, Yasser is also out with Winning Chess Tactics, now available on Chessable.com. And of course, their Move Trainer technology enables you to remember everything that you've learned. It's not enough to look at these patterns once. You need to look at them again and again. And all the better if Chessable does the reminding for you and brings them up when you need to know them. Also, Grandmaster Seirawan's out with a new course on double king pong lifetime repertoires. So lots to check out and learn from Chessable.com as always. Okay, back to the book recap. All right, and we are back, and Neal is going to read the first two paragraphs from Winning Chess Strategy.
I've now written 6 books about winning chess. All the rules and basic information were covered in my first book, Play Winning Chess. Tactical themes were explored in my second book, Winning Chess Tactics, and now, in Winning Chess Strategies, I take you on a journey to a whole different level of chess understanding. On this level, you no longer spend entire games reacting to your opponent. Instead, you are proactive. You think through a position, set a goal, and methodically find ways to reach it. Hundreds of thousands of books have been written about chess. What can you hope to learn from this one? With all modesty, a lot. The aim of this book is simple: to make you think about chess in a different way. In my 2 previous books, I showed you chess as an art and a sport. In this book, I show you chess as a science. My goal in this book is to make you realize that behind the pushing of little wooden men around a checkered board lies a lot of thought. Some of the ideas that make up the science of chess have been used for centuries, millennia in fact. They have been researched, recreated, and refined to suit our purposes and are used by today's grandmasters to reach the perennial goal to win that next game of chess.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah, good intro. And by the way, we should say, I believe this book was originally published in 1994. And then there's a newer edition from 2011. So that gives you a little bit more historical concept and context. In 1994, in particular, as Todd Kennedy and I discussed when we talked about Reassess Your Chess, I feel like chess was just beginning to be explained in a more understandable language, which I think writing has gotten more conversational generally. Like if you look at the way sports writing has evolved over the years, someone like Bill Simmons came in and ushered in a new generation where you just wrote like a normal person and kind of, instead of trying to like write in this sort of flowery prose to like heighten everything that happens. And I think a similar dynamic unfolded in chess. And Seirawan and Silman, who of course are friends, and of course they collaborated on this book, you can sort of see their imprint where like you're beginning to talk like a normal person when you talk about chess, which is welcome in my mind. So that gives you a nice little, inspiring intro, but it doesn't tell that much, I feel like, about what the book is really about. So I wanted to read just 2 more paragraphs also from the first few pages, where Yaz lays out his chess framework. So, and this is specifically about this book. So he says, the goal of strategy is to gain a chess advantage. Being the proud owner of a chess advantage simply means that your position has certain positive features that your opponent's is lacking. There are two types of advantages, static and dynamic. A static advantage is a long-term one, permanent. A dynamic advantage is like a tactic, temporary. You may have a dynamic advantage because your king is safe, whereas your opponent hasn't yet castled. When your opponent castles and brings his or her king to safety, your dynamic advantage disappears. For this reason, it's important to take every opportunity to create static advantages. Put your faith in only those features that will be part of your position for a long time. The role of strategy is to create one or more of the following static advantages. They are more material, superior piece mobility, superior pawn structure, more territory, which means space, or a safe king position, like if you're castled and your opponent has lost the right to castle. So those two paragraphs, I think, really encapsulate kind of the overall philosophy of the book, and I love the way he explained that. Did that strike a chord with you, Neal?
For sure. And I love the way Yasser writes. I love the way Yasser talks. I can tell you, having read lots of chess books, most are incredibly boring, written probably by people who are boring. But Yasser is not a boring man, and that comes across clearly in his books. All of his books that he's written that I've read have this love of the game oozing out of it. And so it's hard not to feel like it's a joy. And if you're going to read a chess book, you might as well read one that brings you a little joy.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, that's why he's one of the most beloved features, one of the most beloved characters in the chess world. And that's why you should come on the podcast, Yasser. So if you guys see Yasser, tell him, stop telling me to get him on the podcast. Tell him to come on the podcast. Okay. So with that out of the way, 11 chapters, the little tests sprinkled throughout. So just to give you guys a little more context of what you might learn about, here are the 11 chapters: the importance of strategy, making the most of a material advantage, stopping enemy counterplay, understanding where the pieces go, superior minor pieces, how to use pawns, the creation of targets, territorial domination, attacking the king, faulty strategies, and the great masters of strategy, which is my favorite chapter because he just goes through Steinitz, Rubinstein, Capablanca, Nimzowitsch, Tigran Petrosian, and Karpov, and just kind of shows a few examples of why he considers them to be the greatest strategic players of all time. Neal, what resonated the most with you amongst these chapters?
Yeah, chapter 2, making the most of material advantage, really stood out and changed the way I look at chess. I can tell you it's the only book of the 7 books I've read about strategy that really takes this question seriously, and probably the most important thing you can teach a club player. Let's say you're in a tournament and you're 1500 level players and one person hangs a rook and you get it. How many times have you heard, oh, I won a piece, but somehow I lost in the end? It happens all the time in club level chess. And it's because often people don't follow the advice that Yasser lays down in this important chapter. Number one, after you win a material, make your king safer. Like king safety, number one. Number two, get your entire army into the fight. Put them on good squares, which either forces your opponent to go to weaker squares or to trade, and trades are going to help you win the end game. So that's number two. And then third, if you're in a position where they get some counterplay for that material loss, you be willing to throw back some material their way in order to create a positional equilibrium that still potentially gives you an in-game advantage. As an example, there is a player, much stronger player than I am, posted a puzzle on Twitter, and he was up 2 pawns, but he was facing 2 monster bishops. And so for me, I was just like, what would Yasser do? Throw back a pawn, trade off all the pieces, go to a simple, boring winning endgame, collect the point. And it was obvious to me what I should do is give back that pawn and induce all these trades on d4. And he didn't do that. He didn't read this book. He lost the game. And so I think that it will change the way you look at chess if you understand these 3 principles around how to win with the material advantage.
Yeah. I liked the quote, and you sort of alluded to it. I was managed to dig it out just now, where he says, a material advantage is a bit like ballast in a hot air balloon. If you start sinking, you can throw some of it over to the side to stop your descent. And yeah, that chapter is an example of one where I felt like it was sort of ingrained in me. So that one didn't resonate with me as much as some of the more positional ones. Like I like when he talked about weak squares and said that you may think you can't capture a weak square, but you actually can capture a weak square, because like once you take control of it, then you can use it. Like, so some of the more sort of nuanced positional concepts were my favorite parts. But there's a lot of good stuff. I mean, so here are three of my favorite instructive tidbits from the book. He talks about different kinds of bishops. I know we talk about different quality of pieces generally when we review these books, because it comes up periodically. But this is another example of where it was a concept I was familiar with, but he had a formulation that made it crystal clear for me, which was the idea of good bishops, bad bishops, and active bishops, which some of you may have heard that formulation before, but I had not. But the idea is, I mean, the textbook definition of good and bad bishops, of course, is just if they're constrained by by their own pawns blocked on their own color. But there can be some situations where your bishop is outside of the pawn chain, where it's in theory a bad bishop, but in practice actually pretty useful. But he does a nice job explaining it and then giving little quizzes like, what kind of bishop is this? What kind of bishop is this? And stuff like that can be really good to train you to think about it in your game as you evaluate when to trade. Number two, again, we alluded to this in one of the quotes we read, but the idea of a static versus a dynamic advantage. This is another one that in my chess reading in recent years, I've certainly come across it and learned to think about it more. But I hadn't seen as many examples dating back to 1991 where you again compare something that's permanent, like doubled pawns, or a king that can't castle, compared to just like you've got your pieces out faster and you better take advantage quickly. Now, one tiny thing, I mean, it's kind of absurd for me to like push back against something Yasser said, but in that quote that he read, that we read earlier in the book, where he said, strive for static advantages, not dynamic. I don't think you necessarily need to strive for one over the other. It's more that you need to be aware of the nature of each of them. So if you do have a dynamic advantage rather than a static one, you should know that you need to act quickly. So that's just my little quibble with it. But overall, I find his talking about that to be quite instructive. And last but not least, on my end, he gives 4 rules for attacking, which I think are also good. So I think another common issue for club players is to know when to attack. You might be the type of player who loves to attack no matter what, or you might be kind of a more conservative player. But in any event, it's nice to sort of have concrete heuristics in mind for when to attack. And he gives the following rules. He says, if you have a space advantage in the vicinity of the enemy king, you should usually play in that sector. If several of your pieces are close to the enemy king, while his defenders are few or far away, that is, you have superior force, your chances of a kingside attack succeeding are probably excellent. If the pawns surrounding the enemy king have been ripped apart or weakened in any way, you can consider an assault in one of the previous conditions, if one of the previous conditions also exists. And if you have a substantial lead in development, you must make use of it before your opponent catches up and your development fades away. A lead in development is a signal for attack, one of the most common. So that does get to what I was saying a minute ago. He does say what to do, but I wouldn't think of either dynamic or static advantage, one being inherently better. I would just have different frameworks in mind for how to approach it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a fair quibble. I think Yasser is a naturally more strategic player. So he's going to go for those long-term static advantages that are never going to go away. And he loves to talk about just torturing his opponent by slowly stealing more space and crippling all his pieces and basically being Karpovian. So I think that I agree with you. It's like I'm all about art of the attack and like using your dynamic advantages to have a quick mate when you can. I don't think one is any better than the other, but I totally get if you're a positional player, you love the torture. Yeah.
And of course, in his announcing, he's always talking about how he's a habitual pawn grubber or whatever it is.
Right.
So like that also is actually it's it's more of a positional style, believe it or not, because you're basically just trying to snatch and grab. You're trying to get the booty and get out, and then just batten down the hatches, and you're willing to play a long game to win, as opposed to where you're going for like a knockout blow where you might be the one giving up the material. So yeah, I mean, it all fits together, but just a minor detail. So what other, obviously there's only so much we can highlight audio only in terms of the instructional content, but are there any other lessons that you feel can be imparted, Neal?
Yeah, I'll list a few, because I'll tell you, this podcast is awesome because we have one person who thinks everything is obvious about chess, and you have one person who thinks nothing is obvious about chess, and I just get infuriated when people are like, "Isn't it so obvious?" I'm like, "No, man, I'm not stupid, but it's just not obvious." And so, like, it's great. I'm here for you. Every club player who has lost a game after being up a rook, I'm here for you. This is for you, man. So my thing,
I feel like I'm not strong enough to play the role of the arrogant grandmaster, but okay, I'll roll with it. Go ahead.
You got half of it, Ben.
Okay.
So my like pearls of wisdom, just a few of them. One was this idea, a couple of thoughts around pawn play. So I love this quote: "Make your center indestructible, and it will choke the life out of your opponent." So what do you take from that? I have often got a pawn on e4 and a pawn on d4, but then I randomly put my pieces around it and they get taken. And they're not indestructible. And so that's just terrible strategy. And so now if I can get that pawn duo on like d4 and e4, then I'm trying to get all my other white pieces to protect those two pawns, because if you can control the center, chances are the other player is going to try a faulty strategy to break through, and then you take advantage of that, often through tactics. So that's one key concept, is make your center indestructible. Another thing that, again, I'm a stupid adult learner. I'm not the child prodigy. I never really looked at the board as an important part of the game. The squares of the board. I thought they were mostly just a universe by which the pieces, which was all I cared about, live. And until you see the board as important as the pieces, you will never understand the concept of a weak square. You will never understand the concept of space. And so this book opened my eyes, and the other chess strategy books also helped open my eyes to realize that the board is as important as pieces. I talked to someone once when I said, "Oh, like that's a fork. You're forking, G7 and this bishop," and he's like, "You can fork a square?"
Right.
And again, for Ben, it's obvious. But for everyone who's an adult improver, it's not obvious. And so I think that was transformational, to see the board as an integral part of the game. I think this idea that whenever you have two moves and one of them not only advances your plan, but thwarts your opponent's plan, pick that one over the other one. It's a nice way to restrict counterplay when you can do a move that does both. We talked a little bit about static and dynamic. I won't add on what you said, but there's some good points there. Target consciousness, which is also, by the way, a chapter in How to Reassess Your Chess, is another kind of mind-blowing, game-changing concept. If you can win a queenside pawn, you can often use that as pressure for the rest of the game to win. Whereas if you instead say, well, there's a queenside pawn I can take, or I can attack this king that's totally defended and I have no chance of winning, but what do I know? I just know how to attack. And then you lose the game and you wonder why. Like, why? This isn't what's going wrong. And so this target consciousness, the ability to look for winning a pawn, or winning a bishop and a rook, or sorry, a bishop and a knight for a rook. These little gains that you can achieve, whether they are or aren't near the king, are often enough to tip the scales in a game.
So can I just hop in for one sec? So the definition of target consciousness is, he defines it as when you see a target, basically relentlessly try to attack it. Is that right, Neal?
Yeah. So let's say there was an isolated pawn on the queen side, and you can put a rook right in front of it or somehow blockade it, and then like get all your pieces to take that one pawn. that can tip the entire game, because one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to win the end game, or chances are your opponent's going to freak out, knowing they're going to probably lose the end game and start an attack that's totally unjustified. Again, if you're a club player, they're probably going to start an attack that's totally unjustified, and then they're going to lose even more material. And so one of the things that I've learned from Yasser is the benefit of making your opponent stew in their own losing juices and just suffer and have the emotional torment that requires them to emotionally lash out in terrible ways, and then ultimately, end the game themselves by making bad moves. So I think this aggression that most chess players have is useful, but sometimes it's better to just slowly strangle your opponent. It's a different way to play. It's equally as good a way to play. So those are some of the things. I mean, the other thing that I got out of it was he had a whole chapter on getting your pieces to the right squares. And he says this is probably one of the most important chapters of the book. And I totally agree that, again, as a person who did not reach title levels as a child, I wouldn't know where to put a bishop. I wouldn't know where to put a rook or a queen. And I think that by understanding the pawn structure and how that's a map to help you figure out where your pieces go related to the pawn structure, it's transforming.
Okay, quite a hearty recommendation. Yeah, and Neal, by the way, mentioned you should tell them you've had quite an improvement in your results since you started reading these positional books, right, Neal?
Yeah, I've been winning more games. I mean, lately it's been all online, but I've been winning more games. And I posted a note on Twitter how it has certainly not hurt my chess that I've been studying strategy. And I think it's another weapon in the toolbox. I think if all you know how to do is tactics, you're basically waiting for a blunder. And as you get better, that's going to happen less often. And you also can't burn all your clock in the middle game because you're clueless. So there are real practical examples of how strategy is going to improve your game.
Yeah, and also even if you are waiting for a blunder, you'll learn better tips for how to wait for a blunder. Right. You'll know, okay, I'm just going to improve my pieces. Like when you were talking about how Yasser was very patient, it made me think again of a recent interview with Grandmaster Keith Arkell and reading Arkell's endings, where he talks about how often all you can do is try to improve your position a tiny bit, and everything else is kind of out of your hands. So yeah, a lot of good stuff. Are we ready for favorite games, or do you have any other highlights, Neal?
No, let's go for favorite games.
Okay, so favorite games. This one, some of my favorites. This is one of my quibbles. I'll spoil. I might have mentioned this a little before, but a lot of the games, I would say maybe 30 to 40%. So not like all of them or anything, but there's some very famous games in here. Now, these games are famous for a reason, Alekine's Gun and Steinitz Blackburn and lots of these sort of classic games. They're famous because they're instructive, but for me, it was just I had seen them in other places. So I'm always looking for fresh material. But for that reason, I mean, of course, I've read Chess Duels. It's my favorite Yasser book and, an all-time classic. So I've seen Yasser's games, some obviously, and also just, being a chess fan, of course I have. But there are a lot of Seirawan games in here that I particularly liked, including one against Czarnicki, which is he sacrifices material for time and just basically never lets him come up for air, and then wins with a beautiful combination. And then he has a quote about the game where he says, "Why did my attack succeed? Though it appeared I was at a disadvantage because I was down a pawn, my lead in development gave me more fighting units than my opponent. Dynamically, I was ahead in material for the short term. Of course, if Black had held me off for a while, I would have been in trouble, but energetic play allowed me to make use of my army's superior development. Always bear this in mind. A lead in development gives you a dynamic material advantage for a few moves before your developed pieces are taking part in the game, while your opponent's undeveloped ones are not. If you have a lead in development, you must use it before it goes away." So again, and you can see how he does a good job kind of hammering home his talking points, not to the point of total redundancy, but to the point of space repetition. You'll see it once and then you'll see it again a couple chapters later. Neal, what were some of your favorites?
Yeah, my favorite game was the Seirawan Karpov London 1982 game, where in that chapter that really changed my life around material, he wins a knight against Karpov, but then gives it back in return for a pawn and then a second pawn, and he really just played out his strategic wisdom. And so every time I am ahead in material, I go to that game in my head and I think, okay, is my king safe? Are all my pieces in fighting? Did I lose anything by gaining this material? Is there any positional advantages that I've lost or that my opponent has gained? And so that game is probably the most transformative for me. Although, I will say, and this is also what separates this book, is that you mentioned the chapter of the strategic greats. Most strategy books don't do that, have a dedicated chapter where they're giving you some chess culture and some chess history. And so I really loved reading those books and those games. And again, for you, all of these games are probably games you've seen many times, but for me, they weren't. And so they're really important lessons.
Yeah, not all of them, but some of them. But again, I mean, they're well known for good reason, and some of them had slipped through the cracks. Like my other favorite game is Karpov Spassky 1974, which, this is the candidate semifinal. This is where this, of course, so. To put this in historical context, Spassky had been the best Soviet player for many years, then lost to Fischer in 1972. And now here we are climbing the mountain again to see who gets to, at this time, they thought actually play Fischer. Of course, it turns out Fischer doesn't play that match, but this is like young upstart Karpov. I believe he was 23 against Spassky, and he just had a beautiful win in the Open Sicilian. Yasser uses it to demonstrate target consciousness, which of course you can use many Karpov games to illustrate something like that. But just a wonderful game with great historical context, because it was kind of like, for anyone who was doubting Karpov at that time, it was a wake-up call. And Yasser says this game was a model of strategic clarity that made Karpov the most feared player of his time. It made an enormous impression on me. And just playing through it, even like I was only later in looking at, like, he just presents it as a game. He doesn't go too much into the history of like that particular moment. But it was only when thinking about it more that I realized, like, wow, that's a major inflection point in terms of like how these chess titans are evaluated. But the game alone is just extremely instructive. So yeah, the book is well worth it. And of course, there's other, like Karpov Korchnoi. There's this very famous E5 interference move that also shows up in the book. So I mean, some of these moves are just so brilliant that even if you've seen them before, you don't mind seeing them again. As for favorite quotes, which I think is one of our last topics before we call it a podcast. One thing about this book is, since it's not 800 pages like Reassess Your Chess, I at least don't have quite as much to say about it. But I already mentioned the one about material being like ballast. The other one, he has got analogies, but not as many as Silman. I mean, Silman is like the king of the analogies, and Yasser has some, but not as many. But here is one where he's talking about using all your pieces. And he says, suppose you're the employer of 4 workers, 2 of whom never make any effort to do their jobs. Would you tolerate this situation? No. So why would you allow any of your pieces to act in the same manner? Make them earn their keep.
That's great.
Yeah, it's fun. What about you, Neal? Do you have any favorite quotes?
Yeah, I love the quote he has later in the book where he says, control of a square alone will not necessarily lead to victory. You must also have other advantages that combine to bring your opponent down. That's from chapter 7, creation of targets. I think that it's hard for me, and probably for lots of club level players, to have the patience to slowly gain several positional advantages. Get that open file, get a little more space, get your knight to a great square, make sure your king is really safe. All of these little things add up. And I think it's hard for kind of a slash and burn type tactical player to think that you got to sometimes win games in different ways. So that really stood out to me. It made me think of something Maurice Ashley loves to talk about, which is the idea of 2 weaknesses. Often one weakness is not enough. And so this concept of you can work really hard to get a knight to a outpost, but that might not be enough. And so you've just got to keep working, grinding. until you get enough advantages to where you often can make a tactical breakthrough.
Yeah, definitely great advice. Yeah, and the theory of two weaknesses famously laid out in Endgame Strategy by Shereshevsky, and lots of canonical examples are particularly useful to keep in mind in the endgame if you're just trying to win like one weak pawn, but there's no other flank to create a diversion on. It can prove a challenge. So what are our overall lessons from this book, Neal? Or are you ready? I'm putting you on the spot here, but I believe at one point, Neal, you ranked all the strategy books. I mean, I know you did a tournament too, but are you ready to straight up rank all 7 of the strategy books that you did?
So I'm doing them by level. So I did 4 what I called kind of introductory level books, and so that was Amateur's Mind by Silman, this book, Steen's Simple Chess, and Best Lessons of a Chess Coach. So those were my 4 intros, and I gave Winning Chess Strategies the number 1 spot. I gave Steen's Simple Chess the number 2 spot. And so I would say if you have never mastered basic strategy, don't bother with anything else. Read Winning Chess Strategies. And then I'm almost done with Modern Chess Strategy by Pachman, and then I'm going to do the ever famous My System by Nimzowitsch. Once I have those 2 done, I'll have a winner in the category with How to Reassess Your Chess. So I would say for basics, definitely Winning Chess Strategy. I want to also say, in context, I think that learning strategy is really about 3 things. It's about understanding the concepts, number 1. 2, reviewing master games that show those concepts, so examples, and then 3, practice with hundreds, if not thousands, of positional puzzles. I think this book really knows its purpose, which is the first purpose, which is to understand the concepts. It's not trying to be everything, and therefore it serves its purpose well. So I think if your goal is to understand the concepts, do this, and then study thousands of master games, as I'm doing right now, and then go after hundreds, if not thousands, of positional puzzles. That's my strategy for mastering chess strategy basics, positional basics, and so that's kind of my recommendation on and improvements. I know you had some quibbles. You already got into some quibbles.
Yeah, I feel like my quibbles are basically covered. So I actually, I don't want to step on our inevitable adult improver interview too much, Neal, that we still have to do at some point. But I do want to pull a little more on this thread and find out more about positional puzzles, for example, because I can think of a few books that have good positional puzzles, but I've previously thought of that as kind of a gap in the marketplace. I don't feel like there are as many as there should be. So what have you found on that topic?
Yeah, so Helliston has a great book called Mastering Chess Strategy.
Yeah, that was one of the main ones I was thinking of. That book is amazing, although definitely on the more advanced side, right?
Yeah, and Geller has a great book of about, I think it's 500, something like that, positional problems. It's basically, what I do. I buy these positional books and then I cut them up as everyone hates, and then I stick them on flashcards and then I cycle through them a la, kind of Woodpecker method, just like I did with tactics. And so I think that I'll say it this way. I learned that strategy is way more like tactics than I realized. Why do I say that? It's because strategy is really a lot about pattern recognition. So imagine seeing one fork and be like, okay, yeah, I'm out. I'm done.
Right. I know what a fork is. Yeah.
I will never miss a fork for the rest of my life.
Right.
Like, that's stupid. But people think that's how strategy works. They'll like read one strategy book and be like, okay, yeah, I'm out. And I think just like with tactics, you have to see examples and you have to practice with do the work. I mean, I know that there was the book, I think it's by Cheng, who's the one who did this, 600.
Yeah, Practical Chess Exercises.
Yeah, Practical Chess Exercises. I did that book. I chopped that book up earlier this year. It's 300 tactics, 300 positional ones. I can tell you that I got as much benefit from doing those 300 puzzles as I did from reading this book, because it doesn't come alive until you can do it. Knowing and doing are not the same thing. And doing comes from practice. So I think that that I read Winning Chess Strategies probably 10 years ago, and it had almost no impact on my chess. But doing it as part of a program, understanding the concepts, doing hundreds of master games or preferably thousands of master games where you actually get a board out and you work through it and you try to figure it out, and then doing puzzles. I think you have to have a program. I don't think you can read any one positional book and think you're going to master positions. I think two problems club players have is they overestimate their abilities, and they have kind of a random approach to study. And I think that if you take it seriously, like I spent 4 hard years to master basic tactics, and it has changed my game. And now I'm going to spend 3 hard years on strategy, and then end games, and then openings finally. And I'm not going to take too much from your future podcast about just improvement, but I think that I am getting better every day by doing a little bit of chess every day in a serious way, not, 5 minutes of end games and then 20 minutes of strategy and then 15 minutes of tactics. I don't know how I'd learn that way. So I think there's something about being totally immersed in a topic that's helpful. So that's a little bit on that.
No, it's a good point. And I love the patience. I mean, I love that like your goals are measured and super long term. So, I mean, that's something that I find myself preaching a lot. I mean, people fall in love with chess and they're rated 1400 and they say, can I become a master? And that's a great goal. And it's, it's probably at the outer bounds of what's possible, I'd say. So, I mean, no one knows, I don't know, no one else knows, but it would be an unusual feat. Let's say that, based on what people have done before, but it's just so far away. Your life is going to change so much. Like no one's doing that in a year in all likelihood. So just make a goal, make a plan, like Neal says, and make a goal that's attainable. And then update the goals as you go on, update your priors, as they say, based on what changes in the new information you get. So yeah, I think that's one great thing about Neal's approach. And that's why you're inspiring so many people on Twitter and becoming an influencer. So every man sends you books and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a couple of quibbles. I'll mention a couple myself. Like one of the things that I'm tracking is how many master games I've played through from, move 1 through the end. And I'm right now at 430 some master games that I've played through on my board. This book, they often will start a game on like move 20. And I wanted to see the whole thing. So like, that's a minor quibble. I mean, the other thing that I actually thought was, as an adult, I think it's awesome. But I think if I was a child, I mean, Yasser is a colorful man, and he talks about multiple times his lust for pawns and how there's going to be an orgy on a square. Right. And, these are words that I can see a young child asking their parents to explain to them. So it kind of depends on where you're coming at and what your age is. But like, I love the Yasser. Like, give me more Yasser. It's like cowbell. Can't have enough cowbell. But I can see how some parents might be like, what is in this book?
Yeah, that's a good warning for parents, because it's the material is at a level that could be quite useful for a lot of fast improving kids. So it's good that you give that warning. Yeah, and I don't really have any other quibbles. I mean, I give this book an unequivocal thumbs up. And even though, again, I'd seen some of the games before, there have been other books I've reviewed on this podcast where even when I think they're worthwhile overall, there were times where it was a drag. Shout out to Blindfold Chess. But that's not the case with this book. I mean, it was a pleasure to read. And for what it attempts to do, as you say, it's wildly successful.
Yeah, it is a joy. There aren't many chess books that I would say, there aren't many writers. I think Silman is a joy to read. I think Yasser is a joy to read. They both helped write this book. And I think that if you're going to go through the slog of reading hundreds of pages, you want it to be around something that's really grabs you, and the pros matter. That's one of the ways I rank. When I talked about ranking the basic chess strategy books, and next I'll be ranking these intermediate strategy books. Pros will be one of those factors. Sure, the choice of positions matter, and games matter, and the completeness matters. But if you're not excited when you pick the book up every morning, then that's hard. So anyway, I love this book. I hope that I've inspired at least one person to give it a go. It's 240 some pages. 8 pages a day. You'll finish it in a month. You'll actually finish a book. I talked to lots of my friends on Chess Twitter who own hundreds of books, never read zero. This is a book you can finish. You'll be proud of yourself. You'll be a better player. You'll thank yourself. You should give yourself a little party when you're done.
Awesome. Great stuff, Neal. And thank you again for coming on. You killed it as usual. Before I let you go, I forgot to mention at the top, but if anyone's interested in guest co-hosting, I still have some people I'm meaning to get back to, and I still have, handful of people that we can roll out over time. But go to perpetualchesspod.com/recaptured if you'd like to come read and talk about a book. I'm always looking for new volunteers. Although, Neal, of course, you're always welcome back as well. I know that you're grinding out these books at an astounding pace. So happy to have you help out. It's a great service.
Well, I'll tell you, Ben, I was a hero of this podcast. I just a big fanboy of this podcast. Before you had me on for the first one, I think listened to all of them, and I still enjoy them when they come out every week. And for me, it's just a treat to be able to be on twice. And I hope that I am a voice of an adult who's trying to get better and doesn't have it all figured out, but is fighting the good fight to do so. And I would just say that these podcasts are in some ways more valuable. The ones around learning to get better are in some ways more valuable for the average club player than talking to a GM. As interesting as they all are, the practicality of talking through how to get better is really inspiring.
Thank you. Yeah, and I get that for sure. That's why we try to do it as much as we can, and maybe we'll look to do even more in the future. So yeah, it's important and it's fun too. I mean, it's amazing how again, this has come up before, but like we talk about it so much, but we just don't know. So that's part of what adds to the allure and the intrigue is we have some ideas about what best practices are for getting better at chess, but there's just enough unknown that like it keeps you coming back and keeps you wondering and wanting to engage and discuss it. So thank you again. And yeah, if you guys aren't already following Neal at Neal Bruce on Twitter, you should definitely do that. If you're not on Twitter, ignore all the political, you should join, follow the chess people, ignore all the politics, ignore all the trolls. And it's worthwhile dialogue and people posting chess puzzles and stuff. So Neal, I do have blindfold puzzles for the listeners, but I'm gonna spare you the torture and bid you another thank you and a good night.
Take care, Ben.
Okay, here we are with 2 blindfold puzzles to keep you busy for the month of October. Number 1 is a mate in 2 puzzle. This one is taken from my heroes over at Chess Steps. This is not intended as a blindfold puzzle, but it functions as one. So mate in 2, here comes the piece arrangement. As always, if you get stumped or if you want to see it, I have 2 links to 2 diagrams in the show notes. The first one links to just the diagram. The second one links to the diagram with the solution. So here we go. White has a king on c6 and a queen on f6, and that's it. So for white, king on c6, queen on f6. For black, pawn on a2 and a pawn on b4. And their king is on a5. So black's pawn 1 square from queening on a2. So once again, black pawn on a2, pawn on b4, and king on a5. And it is white to move and mate in 2. That's puzzle number 1. I think it's solvable for most levels if you stick with it. So puzzle number 2 is going to be more challenging. This one is taken from a game, so I'm just going to read off the moves. This is from a Judith Polgar simul. She played a tactic to end the game rather quickly as against Ken Streck in 1999. So here come the moves. I'll try to say it slow for you guys. And again, the list of the moves will be in the show description. So if you just want to double check what they are and play through them in your head, you can. And then if you click on the link, you'll see what Judith played. E4, D6, pawn to D4, knight to F6, knight to C3, pawn to G6, knight to F3, bishop to G7, bishop to G5, black plays bishop to G4, White plays h3. Black retreats the bishop to d7. White plays queen to d2. Black plays bishop to c6. White plays pawn to d5. Black plays bishop back to d7. White plays pawn to e5. Black plays d takes e5. White plays knight takes e5. Black plays pawn to c6. Judith plays d takes c6. Black plays bishop takes c6. And I'm going to stop there. What did Judith play at that point to make her opponent resign? So could be a move, could be two moves. And I will read it once more from the top. 1. White plays pawn to e4. Black plays pawn to d6. Move 2. White plays pawn to d4. Black plays knight to f6. Move 3. White plays knight to c3. Black plays pawn to g6. Move 4. White plays knight to f3. Black plays bishop to g7. Move 5. White plays bishop to g5. Black plays bishop to g4. Move 6. White plays pawn to h3. Black plays bishop back to d7. Move 7. White plays queen to d2. Black plays bishop to c6. Move 8. White plays pawn to d5. Black plays bishop to d7. Move 9. White plays e5. Black plays pawn takes pawn on e5. Move 10. White plays knight takes e5. Black then plays pawn to c6. Move 11. White plays d takes c6. Black plays bishop takes c6. And now it is white to move and win material. Okay, everyone, thanks for listening. I will catch you guys soon, whether it be on an interview or on next month's Chess Books Recaptured. Take care. Special thanks, as always, to my producer, Matthew Passy, and thanks to those who continue to help spread the word about Perpetual Chess. You can spread the word via word of mouth or positive reviews on podcast platforms. We are up to 98 written reviews on Apple Podcasts, and only one of them aggravates me. Amazing support. By the way, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at BennyFishel1, or join the Perpetual Chess Facebook group and continue the conversation about the latest interview. You should also check out the Perpetual Chess Instagram page. But more than anything, I want to express my gratitude to those who provide financial support to the show. Most of all, I want to thank Chessable.com for sponsoring the show, and to everyone who kicks in via PayPal or the Perpetual Chess Patreon page to help sustain and improve the show, and while they're at it, find out about future guests and send in some great questions. So without further ado, I'd like to give special thanks to the following people and entities. They are Chessable.com, Quality Chess Books, the Capital City Chess Club, the Abysmal Depths of Chess blog, the Apprentice Twitch channel, Andrew Alharji, Andrew Bach, Andy Ryerson, Austin Clough, Benjamin Porteau, Bill Sigler, Kathy Carr, Chad Oliver, the Charlotte Chess Center, the Chess Central's Chess blog, Chessmood.com, Chris Flanagan, Dan O'Hanlon, Danny Davidson, David Schreiber, I am Dimitri Schneider, Drake Domingue, I am Eric Rosen, Firas Sawaf, Gary Foreman, Greg Harfst, Greg Natel, I am Greg Shahadi, Guven Monet, James Kennedy, Jens Green, John Jernigan, John Rockefeller, John Cromarty, John MacArthur, Kelly Palmer, Kevin O'Callahan, King Selt, Lucio Casada Silva, the law offices of Stuart Katz, LeelaAnalysis.com for cloud-based Leela Engine Analysis, Michael Can, FM Michael Oblin, Mike Zelazny, Mr. Mike Shahadi, the famous Mr. Dodgy, the Nerdnaze Twitch channel, Peter Sadi, the Play More Chess Academy of the Hamden Chess Club, Reuven Fisher, Robert Coucher, Seattle Chess Club, Shane Unger, Stephen Kelty, Stephen Martinez, Thomas Stenix, Thomas Tachenko, Todd Bryan of StrongChess.com, Todd Kennedy, Wayne Beam, and I would also like to thank Aaron Waffler, Ace Vallega, Adam Ralph of ChessEngland.com, Adrian Gutierrez, Alex Pejas, Andy Ryerson, FM Andre Terakov, Dr. Andrew Perry, Aniti Deer, Barry Hessian, Bill Juniper, Bill Moran, Brad and Andy Rosen, Brett Howard Lynn, Brian Mullis, Bruce Scott, Brian Tillis of Palm Beach Chess, Chad Hilton, Dr. Charles Snodgrass, Chris Wayne Scott, Christopher Baumgartner, Christopher Chabris, Chris Lott, Christopher Wood, I am Christoph Zalecki, aka Chess Explained, Coach J's Chess Academy, Costa Carras, Courtney Fry, Craig Mallon, Daniel Ginsberg, Daniel Naylor, Dave Saylor, David Bleskacek, David Cramley of Chessable.com, Dalen Shelton, Dirk Decker, Drake Domingue, Dwayne Edmonds, Ed Daly, Ethan Smith, Hallelujah Cat, Ian Mason, FM Donnie Ariel, Fox Valley Chess Club, Francis Letarte Lavoie, Frank Tortoris MD, Frank Zananis, Gary Andrews, Gary Lewis, Geert Vanderveld, Gerard Barta, Giovanni Russo, Hans Schut, Harish Srinivasan, Jacob Kovac, Jacques Perry, James Aspinwall, James Bonastia, James Muir, Jason Woolham, Jaydeep Chakrabarty, Jeff Anderson, Jeffrey Martello, Yep Hoyland, Jerry Wells, Jim Ratliff, JJ Stranad, Dr. John Fallon, John Fernandez, John Fontaine, John Hartman, John Jeffrey, John McMurtry, Jonathan Slater, Jose Rodriguez, Justin Gardner, Jen Shahadi, Joel Rocky, John Thompson, Grandmaster Josh Friedel, I am Kare Christensen, WGM Katerina Nemtsova, Kelly Palmer, Kevin Pryor, I am Kostya Kovutsky, Krishna Gopala Krishnan, Kyle McAvoy, Larry Ryforth, Laura Boyowski, Martin Knudsen, Martin Krug, Matthew Passy, Matthew Tedesco of SeattleChessMeetup.org, the Mechanics Institute Chess Club of San Francisco, Michael Allard, Michael Hudson, Miguel Arispide, Mike Clem, Mitchell Fabian, Nate Solon, Neil Bruce, Negmat, Milad Janov, Olaf Mueller-Michaels, GM Pascal Charbonneau, Passy Passanen, Paul Bain, Paul Clarkson, Paul Swaney, Paulo Santana, Peter Lux, Randy Temple, Ricky Grijalvo, Richard Hollenbach, Robert Turner, Roy Yearwood, Ryan Berg, the Say Chess YouTube channel, Scott Doherty, Scott McKinnon, Sebastian Finsterwater, Shane Unger, Stefan Roller, WGM Tata of Abrahamian, Tim Brennan of TacticsTime.com, Tim Seymour, Timothy Ha, Tom Edsel, Tomas Kolmanich, Tony Rotella, Tyron Price, Vishnu Srikumar, William H. Brock, William Juniper, William Hogarth, William Peterson, FM Zhao Chang of Chess1000.com, and Zhivko Storyanov. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I will catch you all next week.